congratulations, and thanks for the invitation. So the format of this panel will be very similar to the previous one. I would like to throw 2 or 3 ideas, hoping to trigger some discussion. So here are the ideas. The title of this panel is The Future of Climate Change Research. And the first thing that I would like to propose is that whatever that future looks like, it's very clear that it will be research that informs decisions, informs development, informs policy making. And in order to do that, in order to develop research programs that inform development, we need more than just good science. We need good science. The CG has been doing great science. We need more of that. We need even better science than that. But good science is not enough. If we really want to inform development efforts, we have to translate that good science into something usable, understandable, actionable. And in order to do that, we need to consider context. We need to integrate climate knowledge with agriculture knowledge, with food systems knowledge. So again, whatever the future of climate change research looks like, it must be integrated. And I like something that I believe Martin said. The CG offers to us, the scientific community, probably the best opportunity to connect to development efforts in agriculture. But the CG cannot do everything. I agree. The CG, the best, in the same way that for us in the scientific community, the CG is probably the best opportunity to collaborate, the CG must be aware that they cannot have specialists in every single area needed to advance in research. So those are 2. 1, future research must inform development, and 2, in order to do that, it's good science, but it's also integrated and translated. The third one has to do with something that Andy did this morning. And it has to do with adaptation. We all witnessed what happened this morning, right? The CIAT had this amazing opportunity of hosting the president of Colombia. That's the best opportunity that a CG center can have. But it also created a challenge. It disrupted the agenda, right? Completely disrupted the agenda. So who came up? Andy. And what did he do? He created an activity that was good. It was very good for me. I talked to my neighbor there. We exchanged some knowledge. And he saved the morning. Now, think about it. He saved the morning, and that was good enough. But he did something much more important, because he allowed the president to meet with Ruben and other people outside of this room, and the impact that that will have in the future will be huge. So he was acting today. He was confronting a challenge of today, but investing and modifying the future. What I would like to propose is that that's the same approach that we need for climate change. The truth, and I'm sorry to tell this to Christian, we don't know what the climate will look like in the future. We have some ideas. We know that it's going to be warmer. We don't know what's going to happen with the precipitation. So we really don't know what it's going to. We know some things. It's going to be more variable. It's going to be more risky. So I would use Andy's approach. What can we do today to improve adaptation to climate-related risks, whatever the future climate looks like? So with those 3 elements, I would like to open the floor. Please.
Hang on. Okay, no, thanks, Walter. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I spent my last 15 years before joining CGIAR working to try and integrate climate change into development organizations. And it's great to be in CGIAR and try and learn where are we at in the spectrum of our progress of truly internalizing climate change? I'll reflect a little bit on my past experience, at least the questions I'm asking myself, and really keen, if we have time for discussion, to hear your thoughts. The first is, are we making the case for so-called climate research? And is that case being made globally? The second is, how can we see this less as a standalone research theme? And I know that's not the CCAFS approach, and huge congratulations to CIAT and CCAFS for really framing this as a contextual, almost a lens you can apply to everything we do. So how do we, in a sense, frame this and encourage our partners to frame this in a very different way than perhaps the maybe 10, 20 years ago you might do specialized climate research? The third is how do we invoke that sense of urgency and understand the sense of urgency around this issue? And the fourth is, what are the funding opportunities in this space? And how do we, in a sense, continue to fund our work? So very briefly, and I'll try and make this quick, how do we make the case for what we're doing? I think we've started well. I would credit, and I say this is coming from outside CGIAR, CCAFS, again, many thanks to CIAT, for really putting this on the agenda. I mean, really, about 8 years ago, when I was doing Margarita's job in IFAD, it was really hard to even have a discussion about agriculture in the climate world. It was all about energy. That's changed a lot, thanks to the work of you. I think we've still got a long way to go, but we are reframing the debate, and reframing it in a way where I think we need to, and that penny is dropping, that agriculture in many ways is the make or break issue in terms of achieving the NDCs, the national sort of development plans. And it's make or break partly because we are not nearly as well advanced as many other sectors of our economy that have been investing for years, as Jürgen said, in developing the programs and developing the technologies to at least have what we need on the shelf to scale up, to tackle issues. We don't have everything on the shelf. And I think there's perhaps a false debate that I experienced in working in many development programs, that, oh, we don't need research in this space because there's tons of stuff on the shelf. It's a sort of binary zero-sum discussion that you don't need research, you don't need investment in analysis because you've already got many things on the shelf. We need both, given the severity of the problem. And I think when you actually try and apply climate change research to actual decision making, you're confounded in many cases. Often what you sort of have analytically for climate projections of certain carbon projections of certain techniques are not borne out when you actually test that in the field. So it's a bit like a sort of a Russian doll. You answer one problem and you open it up and we discover there are way more things we don't know. So I would really challenge the notion that it's just about scale up. It's about both. And I think we need to continue making that case because there's a seductive path that it's really not about new knowledge and new analysis. I think there's also, as I said, a stronger case to be made around positioning agriculture in the climate debate, and I think we've probably come halfway there. So that's the first thing. Let's make the case for it, and let's build on the great work that's already been done. Second is, and this was perhaps done as a provocative title, let's not talk about climate change research. There's no such thing in many ways. There's some specialized areas around forecasting, but there's a climate lens that when you apply it to anything, and I would really challenge any researcher, and I'd love to get examples where we can truly say hand on heart, what we do is not disrupted, confounded, driven, related to the climate challenge. And whether that challenge is really understanding the interdependencies of our ecosystems, which when you've got solid ecosystems, you might not see them, but when they're fragile and weak, in a very non-linear way, those very quickly come to the fore. So whether it's about thinking differently about interdependency of what we do, understanding the environmental footprint, as Jürgen so eloquently put, planning for more variability in everything we do in our context, understanding long-term trends, planning for the second-order effects. I mean, this changes our whole operating environment in a way that I certainly felt that most development organizations were just struggling with. I mean, and frankly, in my experience, we're maybe about a third of the way down the road of truly internalizing it. And the question I ask myself is, where are we on that journey? And are we configured appropriately to, in a sense, respond to what is the kind of generational challenge that CGIAR was set up for? many years ago, when there was a different challenge, but one that was a huge global challenge that needed analysis and science to underpin it. We have exactly the same issue now. And so the question I'm keen to have a discussion on is, have we configured ourselves appropriately to be able to rise to that kind of scale of challenge, which in a sense entirely supports the existence of a CGIAR. And I think there's more discussion we need to have on that. And that relates to my third point, is urgency. We don't have the luxury of 10, 20 years to get this right. Each year where we don't, in a sense, change the trajectory of emissions and all the things that that leads to, we're running out of time, and we're getting into some quite scary, actually quite non-linear disruptive impacts that will affect agriculture too. So there's a sense of urgency around what we do here that I think should inform that discussion about how we mobilize ourselves. And my last point was just, how do we translate the sense of urgency around our funding challenges and the way in which more and more public international financial transfers are earmarked and attached to this challenge, appropriately so, of climate change, when in many cases agriculture has not been benefiting tremendously from those financial flows. They've often gone into investment in energy, in transport, in other places. How do we benefit from that? And I think there's also a discussion to be had around, have we got the right kind of financial resource mobilization vehicles, approaches to be able to enable agricultural research to benefit from those kind of financial flows. And I think there's big opportunities there. So, back to you.
Great, thank you very much. Ana María?
Yeah, so before addressing... Okay. So before addressing Walter's questions or points, I really like to thank CIAT and the organizers of the event for including me in this panel. I'm very happy, of course, and honored to be part of this discussion and sharing the floor with you. So I agree with what Walter just said in terms that we need to do the research, but we need to do a research that that has a specific target and that it's translated in a way that can really help different users to make their decisions. And even though we saw during the morning, and Ricardo showed very well the impact that CIAT has done in the past 50 years, I still believe that the challenge is huge. And that somehow, and this is talking from the research community, I think that this is the right moment to think about the way that we are working with partners. Not only the way that we are engaging with partners, but the type of partners that we are working with in order to generate the impact that we want to generate with our research. And I was very happy to hear about CCAFS and Jürgen saying that CCAFS have really changed the way that we have doing things. And one of the most important things that we have been doing in CCAFS is basically think deeply about the way that we are engaging with partners. So we have been using in CCAFS this, what we have called this 3/3 principle in terms of engaging and working with partners. And there are 3 words for this 3/3 principle. So we talk about needs, we talk about research, and we talk about capacity. So according to this approach, what we are suggesting, and this is what we have been doing in the past, and it has been proven to be really successful to get us closer to generating this impact with our research, is that any research for development program should allocate its resources in 3/3. So 1/3 should go directly to next users, to building relationships with them. And here, I won't get tired of emphasizing the importance of building these strong relationships. But also, working hand by hand with the next users in terms of understanding what are their needs from research. So coming up with the research questions. So a lot of times, the researchers, we come up with the questions by ourselves. And we are losing a huge opportunity of really getting closer to generate that impact with our research by excluding from that process the next users that are the ones that are going to use that research. So really working with them in terms of finding out what are the needs, what are the research questions that we would like to address. So that's 1/3 of resources. Another third should go to research per se, because that's what we do research. But in here, again, think about doing this research with other research partners. And in here, I want to emphasize the importance of working with the corpoicas of all the countries, the natural agricultural research systems and centers and institutes, and being wise enough to discover what are the complementarities. So not being perceived as competition, but being able to work together hand by hand so we can improve the science that we are generating. And then a third of these resources should go to capacity of our next users. So now that we have addressed the research questions, now that we have generated the knowledge, it's very important that these tools, this knowledge, that the next users can work with this, can use the tools by themselves so that we can improve the uptake of this research. So also very important, it's to consider the type of relationships that we are generating. So, and this is not new. We have been talking about these partnerships for a long time. But I really believe that like thinking about this seriously and really putting that into your agenda, as well as spending resources on this, it's going to make a difference in terms of impact with our research. So building strong, clear relationships based on trust and ownership, and very, very important that we have a common vision of wanting to achieve those impacts with our research. So that's a little bit of like talking from our experience in CCAFS, what we have been doing in terms of engaging with partners. But also, I would like to say a few words about the type of partners that we should be engaging, and we, the scientific community, should be engaging more and more in this climate change research agenda. So I want to highlight 4 types of partners that I see that scientists should be engaging more in the future. So we should be working together with partners, particularly implementing partners, so local organizations, in order to build field evidence of what works, where, under which circumstances. And in here I see a huge potential in the future of working in the climate smart villages, even though I could be a little biased because that's what I work for. But I really believe that this is an opportunity for scientists all around the world to generate with these local organizations this field-based evidence of what works. And in here I really believe that we need to look to the past, and we need to learn from our failures. And we need to get away from wasting resources and time on doing research on technologies without really understanding how these technologies are going to interact with specific contexts in order to be implemented successfully. And this also requires bringing into the picture more soil scientists in our research. And they don't have to be specifically in the CGIAR, but partnering with research partners. So for instance, having behavioral economists interacting with agronomists, with climatologists, in order to really understand how farmers make decisions under uncertainty, under climate risk circumstances. So we should also be working with partners, particularly with climate risk management services provider, so that we can strengthen institutions and services through a better use of climate information. A third very relevant partner is the policy partners. And I really believe that we as scientists, we need to engage with policy partners so that we can understand what works for coordinated policy and governance in the climate change arena. And finally, we need to work closely with partners, the large agencies, the companies driving implementation. We need to work with them so we can understand what works for investments to reach a scale. So that's a little bit in terms of partners, and I think that this is a very good moment to think about the type of partners that we are engaging in. But also I would like to say a few words about somehow the topics that will also be included each time more in the climate change research agenda. And in here I totally agree with what Jürgen said in terms that we are not targeting just one objective right now. So if we look to the past 30 years in the agricultural research, we had one main objective, which was increasing productivity in the agricultural sector. It was very complex. It is still a very complex question, but it's one clear one and one single target. I think that the picture now it's different and it's going to become more complex in the future because we need first to satisfy an increasing food demand, but we will need to consider a growing population, we need to consider land degradation, and we need to consider as well the climate change impacts. But this is not the only thing that should be in our research agenda. We also need to find out how to increase farmers' incomes. And at the same time, we have to do all this reducing the ecological footprint from agriculture. And if this wasn't hard enough, we need to do all of this, improving higher equality, social equality. So I guess that the big question in here is how to address all these 4 targets simultaneously through the climate change research agenda. And in here, I will start by saying what we shouldn't be doing anymore. So we need to stop thinking in a fragmented manner. We need to stop putting things in different boxes. So for instance, there is no point on continue doing research in adaptation, mitigation, productivity, and food and nutrition security separately. We need to understand the synergies and trade-offs between those 3. That's the research that we need to do. How do they interact? We need to stop doing research on technologies in a vacuum without understanding the relationships between them and the context. And we need to stop promoting technologies without really understanding or having a clear pathway as how these technologies are going to be upscale and outscale. And we need to really understand which, along the whole value chain, which are the stakeholders that we need to influence to make that happen so that many people can adopt these technologies and practices. So this is why I see a huge opportunity on this systemic kind of approach. So climate smart agriculture, livestock plus, things like that where we are considering the synergies and trade-offs between adaptation, mitigation, food and nutrition security, understanding how contexts interact with these technologies so they can successfully implement it, and all these in a context of sustainable food systems. I really believe that this kind of systemic approach is the one that can get us closer as the scientific community to generate impact with our research.
Thank you, Ana María. Margarita.
Muy sensible. So I think this is the effect of me being so happy of being here in Palmira, where I was born. So I'm very pleased to be back here in my hometown, representing the International Fund for Agriculture Development in this very important date, the birthday of CIAT. I must say that I was born pre-CIAT, and because my dad came here thanks to the Rockefeller Foundation, so I'm very grateful that I was born here due to the Rockefeller Foundation sending him here to Palmira to start this small group of researchers in agriculture in Colombia. So for us, in the International Fund for Agriculture Development in IFAD, I would say we have a lot of the answers to Ana Maria's concerns, because we are a bank of the United Nations. We lend money and we also provide grants. But as a bank, we need to recover our investments. We need to lend money to governments that will use it for agriculture only in the niche of smallholders. Somebody was earlier asking about smallholders. Our niche is only smallholders and artisanal fishers. So to make sure that the countries can pay us back, integrating environmental sustainability and climate change are key. We may not know exactly the impacts, but it's happening every day. We just go to the rural areas, and the farmers themselves are saying, well, for the last 2 years, my crops haven't gone anywhere. I haven't been able to do what my great-grandfather was doing, producing sugarcane, or cassava, or coffee, or cocoa, or corn. So it's evident that we need to help them out, and that's what IFAD is doing. And obviously, IFAD is not a research institution, but what we know is that without research, we couldn't do our job. We have been working on climate resilience for many years in IFAD. I think starting around 2004, IFAD started working towards increasing resilience of smallholders. But it was not until 2012 with the Adaptation of a Smallholder Agriculture Program funded by many of the donors that are here, and which is the largest adaptation program for smallholders that, as Elwyn was saying, he was my predecessor, so he was sitting on that big program before. We managed to get to 41 countries with investments that have helped those smallholders to adapt to climate change. And it's a real big fan of different approaches that we have used to support this adaptation to climate change from smallholders or by smallholders. Because it ranges from climatological, meteorological stations. In some countries, particularly in Africa, there is no information about, is it going to rain tomorrow? Or is it going to be a flooding? Or is it going to be very cold or very hot tomorrow? So this information is key for the smallholders to be able to plan and to adapt and to do something about it before it happens. Then we have investments in innovation. For example, for us, rural infrastructure, post-harvest facilities, the smallholders, somebody was saying about the losses of food. Yeah, a lot of the losses of food in the developing world are due precisely because of the post-harvest facilities that are non-existent, or because of the roads that the produce cannot be taken in time to the markets. So that's why through ASAP, we have been supporting this variety of actions that help those smallholders not just produce better, but also get to the markets safely. But going back to the importance of research, one of the key areas we have been funding and supporting is the whole CGIAR research. Because as this morning was discussed, we need seeds that are able to adapt to the new realities. We have more droughts, we have more flooding, we have more salinity, we have sea level rise. So the impacts of climate change are felt everywhere where we go. Therefore, the seeds need to be adapted to that. Another area that for us is key is what we have done in partnership with CIAT on the climate change scenarios, analyzing risks and vulnerability. For example, we have the case of the work we did in Nicaragua, where through that deep analysis, we concluded that we couldn't support the government of Nicaragua to invest where they wanted to invest in coffee, because the areas the country wanted to invest in were going to be too hot for coffee to have a long-term success. So we had to, after having the information that was produced by CIAT, go to the government and the smallholders to convince them that they needed to diversify. They needed to change the crops. And it was difficult because the farmers are saying, oh, but my grandfather planted coffee and I can export coffee. I know coffee is a good business. Yeah, but if in 4 years the coffee is dead or in 10 years, then it's not a good investment. So it's good, it's bad for the farmers, it's bad for the government, and bad for us because they cannot pay us back. So we managed through this process, participatory process, to convince all of them to change some of those areas to plant cacao that is cocoa that is adapts better to climate change. So we see now the links, because one of the questions was, what do we do research for? And I think as a scientist initially, I would say that scientists wanted to do research for the sake of research, with all due respect, because I used to do that. But now we are getting into a point that we really need to do research that can be applied to help governments achieve what they need to achieve, to help governments and citizens to achieve sustainable development, but at the same time not destroying the planet, as it's been mentioned several times. So that's, I think, what we are trying to do is to make sure that every country has a different type of options, because it's the diversification, but it's also the value chains. How do we ensure that we are greening the value chain? We are taking into account the impacts of climate in the whole value chain to ensure that those products will get to the markets. The other area that I also wanted to highlight that you mentioned is the area of partnerships. Because for us, I must say that the Learning Alliance that we have with the CCAFS has been extremely important to exchange and generate knowledge. And I think that's another area. Sometimes a lot of wonderful research is done, but so few people. It's like the converted are talking to the converted. And only the converted know the results of the research. But how do we make sure that those very good research results are shared with whom is needed? And I think for that, CCAFS has been very helpful, and our alliance with CCAFS, because we go then, for example, with the South-South exchange, where we bring farmers and project managers from Asia and different countries in Africa to exchange knowledge. What has worked for you, what hasn't, what has failed? Because I think sometimes that's what the farmers need, not that we, those that know it all, or as we used to say in Colombia, those tall blonde ones are going to tell us what is right and what is wrong. So here is the farmers promoting this exchange, I think is very useful. So I would leave it at that. I can come back with other ideas afterward. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is very good. We have very good timing. We will have about 10 minutes for questions, which is great. But let me bring back some of the issues that I heard in this panel that I think are interesting. Elwyn told us how, and I agree, how important is that climate change is now in the agenda. One question that I would like to pose is, has climate change, the issue of climate change, has it been in the agenda in the right form? So I would like to propose that in many cases when all we had in the agenda was a climate scenario for 2080, which is extremely uncertain, I would like to propose that that was not very helpful. You know, the best thing that the science can do in that area is provide scenarios that are very uncertain. And so if you provide scenarios for policymakers that are very far in the future and that are very uncertain, wouldn't that create paralysis? Or even worse, wouldn't you be running into the danger of maladaptation? I would like to rediscuss the example of the coffee, because we have Rob Bertram here, and for those of you who don't know him, he heads the Bureau of Food Security of USAID. And he was telling me in an informal discussion how in some areas of his program, people were worried of investing in corn because the scenarios were showing that 80 years in the future, in those areas, there will not be enough precipitation. And that is, how should I say that, diplomatically? That is not very good. That is like saying, you know, for you guys that work in prices, the best thing that a climate model can do with scenarios for precipitation at local level in the future is something like the price of corn in 2080 will be anywhere between $180 per ton and $3,000 per ton. Now you can take some number in the middle and then do all your scenarios, but just be aware that that's the reality. The reality is the best science cannot tell you what the precipitation will look like in Palmyra or in Nicaragua. It can tell you about temperature. So that's one general concept that I would like to pose to trigger more discussion. Then from Margarita and María, the other very strong message is if we really want to inform development efforts, we need to stop thinking in boxes, in these comfortable zones. We need to start interacting more between disciplines. We need to start, Margarita was saying this, we need to start thinking how to communicate better. There's a lot of information available that is wonderful, and it could be informing development efforts, and it's not. And why is it not doing it? In part, maybe because it's not communicated in the right way. In part, because no policymaker is interested in the thermodynamics of clouds. They're interested in what that means for the crops in their countries. And so, how do we create as a future line? I also like what you said, Elwyn, about is there something real like climate change research? But in the future, the efforts in that area, in climate risk management, in climate sensitive, they must have take that into consideration. Is how do we communicate, how do we integrate information so that it helps? And so with that, I don't know if any of you guys would like to add some short comments on this, and then we open the floor, or we go directly to the floor. Okay. Questions, yeah. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure, in English? Okay, my name is Mario Piedra. I'm from Costa Rica. I work for CAT. But I would like to pose the question. I am not an expert on climate change, I have to say. But I think one issue that has not been discussed here is how can we improve, understand better the extreme events? We tend to understand much better. Well, I don't know if we understand. We tend to play better with models displaying more than the medium or long-term predictability, with the uncertainty you mentioned. But just to give an example, in my little country, we had this year a tropical storm, and we have so many hurricanes that literally destroyed the islands. And last year we have, for the first time in our history, one hurricane that came somewhere in the border between Nicaragua and Costa Rica. The point is that we have dealt particularly with flooding and issues all our lives, but it's nothing like we have seen right now. Nothing. And if the climate change research can help in terms of understanding extreme events, will be much better, because all the economic gains of decades are wiped out in one night. And there is no way to describe the losses that we go through. And it's not just one crop, it's the whole chain, it's the infrastructure at the farms for the harvesting, for the storing, everything. And we just don't understand what extreme events mean for the production areas of our countries. And it seems to me that there has been a lack of focus on these issues. And I don't know how complicated it is. It's just something that I have dear to my heart, because we have been suffering quite dramatically for the past few months on that. Thank you.
Elwyn, you want to take that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And don't worry, I'm not sure anyone is an expert on climate change. It's so big, and we need to get away from this notion that I would never claim to be. It's so big that you can be expert on certain aspects of it, but I'm not sure any one human can actually be an expert on every aspect of it. But in your question, I think so many of what you're doing, right, Margarita, through ASAP, is really about working with communities, with food systems, with supply chains, to have a discussion around, well, okay, you've had a once in 30-year drought. Well, what if that's every 5 years, or maybe every 10 or 3 years? We don't quite know. but how do you get much better at risk management? And actually the mentality of certainly many government ministries doing value chain projects with IFAD, I remember, was really about how do you optimize production. It was all about assuming the world of the past that was a lot more stable of the world of the future. So actually the development programming became much more about better risk management, thinking about risk and the resilience of your systems. That was a dimension that was almost entirely overlooked in the past. And if I might just add something about the discussion around climate, agriculture in the climate world. I mean, my sense of this was that for a number of years you had climate forecasting debates and everyone obsessed about the science because people were challenging it, right? And then we started having a discussion about energy and transport, and that was seen as low-hanging fruit. And great progress was made, and a lot of scaling up is being done. And over the last 5 years, thanks to colleagues from FAO and certainly CCAFS and elsewhere, we've had a discussion about agriculture. It started actually as how can agriculture benefit from these wonderful carbon emission trading schemes that we thought were going to pull billions into smallholder farming, and then actually evolved into everything we've just discussed, but with a great deal of caution in the global negotiations, because agriculture gets into your really deep, difficult sovereignty issues. So a great deal of nervousness about how deeply you bring that discussion into that sort of global forum around climate policy making. So I think it's evolved, but I still feel it's actually got quite a long way to go.
Just to add a very short comment, and going back to Andy's approach in this morning, I think, although these climate change scenarios are extremely uncertain, the climate science community agrees pretty robustly in that you can expect increased climate variability. So, and this is why it's so important to ask ourselves when we are trying to inform development efforts in a country, and we get demands to help them improve adaptation. The first question is, are you well adapted to current climate? Are you well adapted to current climate variability? When you have a flood, when you have droughts, your system works very well? And in 90% of the cases or more, the answer is no. So what can we do today to improve that capacity of adapting, reducing, management, improving risk management? And that's the best way to improve adaptation to future climate. So, okay. More questions? Yes, please.
Thanks. If I can just follow up on the point that Elwyn made towards the end there. So, the sensitivity of policy and politics and carbon trading and all the rest of it. But we are talking about, this is a session on research. So research takes time. So assuming that policy change will move ahead, these negotiations will take place, assuming that one day there'll be a possibility of farmers, big and small, being able to take advantage of climate change in terms of sequestration of carbon, as opposed to the current situation where, with all due respect, and the points from the panel have been great, but it's all been about this horrible thing called climate change. How can we adapt? How can we survive? How we can, get through the next awful thing? But turning things round, eventually, when policy catches up, will science and research be there and have anything to offer when the opportunity of carbon farming actually politically becomes possible for farmers, big and small, all over the place, to actually have another income stream from technology that starts putting carbon back into the soil, or whatever way of sequestration the scientists may have invented by then. So I suppose my question is, is anybody doing anything in the research area to be prepared for that moment?
Sorry, Margarita. I think
Oh, sorry.
Okay. So, no, I just want to say something very important regarding that question, because fair enough, I don't have the answer for that question, but the fact is that we have to increase our food production in 60% by 2050. So it's very good if we can help them get earnings from carbon markets. But we cannot leave out the fact that we need to produce more food. And as it was mentioned before, we have to produce more food, but without increasing our footprint and making sure that the planet will give opportunities for the coming generations behind us. Therefore, we have to make sure we have a balance. And maybe going back to the issue of scenarios and uncertainty, yeah, many of the scenarios are for 2050, and we think maybe that's very far away. But in fact, that is not far away. And that's almost tomorrow. And when we started doing the reports or reading and reviewing the IPCC reports, we all started saying, oh, well, that's in the future. But suddenly, the next IPCC report came and said, oh, well, we thought it was 2050, now it's 2030. So in fact, those scenarios are very helpful to make sure that people understand that the danger is there and that we need to act and that we need to take sort of action at all levels immediately. We cannot just sit here and say, well, maybe it's 2080, no rush, because in fact, we are seeing the changes every day as we go forward. And on the disaster reduction, I think it's very important. We were discussing years ago about the global observing systems. And these global observing systems that will really help us to have sort of an early warning system at the global level. Now we have moved into the national early warning systems. And now we have also realized that we need more localized early warning systems that will help us at least know. Doesn't help us preparing because we don't know when it's coming. If it's coming tomorrow, of course, there is no time. But at least if we had enough information in a timely manner, measures could be taken. But for example, I see, of course, what we have seen with El Niño and La Niña and how this has affected Central America, for example, and now Africa. So again, we see now El Niño and La Niña, not climate events, but exacerbated by climate change. We see the problems that we are having right now, for example, in South Africa, in some countries in Asia. So definitely improving the resilience, even if it's not climate related, will help those farmers to cope with the shocks of these very serious events. And the planning, how, where do we build, how do we build? That is also extremely important to ensure that when the event comes, not everything goes away with the flooding or the storm.
Well, yeah, mine is working. Yeah, I just, very fast, I wanted to address two topics that you mentioned. So the first one in relation to the scenarios and uncertainty. So the way that we have been using these scenarios, even though we all realize that there's a huge uncertainty in these scenarios, but so policymakers are thinking, for instance, think about the National Planning Department in Colombia, Departamento Nacional de Planeación. So what they need to do is long-term, long-run planning. And these scenarios, the way that we are working with the scenarios is just understanding that these are scenarios. And if we can construct diverse scenarios, plausible by diverse scenarios, it has been really helpful in order to inform and and understand how robust are these policies. Because if the policies are able to work well on all these scenarios, then we have a robust, good policy that we are close to each other that it's going to help whenever these things come. So in CCAFS, we have had a scenarios program, and we have been working with many different countries around the world, and it has been very interesting in terms of helping policymakers on doing policy, thinking about the long run, and thinking about all these uncertainties. So I think that this is a good use of that. Then I wanted to address a little bit the disaster risk management, and I see a huge potential in the future, but again, we have to partner with the financial services provider in terms of insurance. And there's a lot of barriers for insurance, and there's a lot of research being done in terms of how can we get to smallholders with the insurance so they can benefit from insurance. But then seeing insurance as part of a package of climate risk management, it's also really helpful in order to deal with this climate risk and climate variability. And then with carbon storage. So in CCAFS we have been, the mitigation portion, it's important. And one of the key questions of that, I mean, yeah, research takes time, and for sure this is going to take that, and somebody has to do it, but also we need to analyze what are the possibilities in terms of the political context that this can happen at some point. And that's a lot of research that it's coming from the social scientists, and that needs to be done as well as we are doing that other type of research.
Great. So just to clarify, because I think, Margarita was saying something that is critical. It's not that we think that 280 is too far away. What we're saying is right now, it's right, very short. 250 is even closer. So we know that, but what exchange rate of the Colombian peso to dollar will you use for 2049? Right? So, the scenarios are great, like Ana Maria was saying, they're great tools for sensitivity analysis. The danger is when you believe one scenario. So that was just a comment. This was a great panel. I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we don't. So I would like to thank Margarita, Ana Maria, and Elwyn, and you guys for your good questions. Thank you.